So with very quick introduction, I'm Kimonas Sotirchos, those Greek names, and I'm responsible for leading the notebooks working group. So, and I've been on this part of the community for at least 2.5 to 3 years now. So I'd like to give you also a small overview of what does the notebooks working group maintain. And then also, since as you'll see in a second, it's quite diverse, I'll try to give you, since we have just 20 minutes, an overview of where we're going with each component. So initially, when the separation of working group started, notebooks working group maintained, as you can guess it, the notebooks controller, the Jupyter web app that was responsible for spawning Jupyter notebooks, and some example notebook images. But the truth is that we also maintain quite a lot of other crucial components for Kubeflow. And for example, we have the profiles in Kubeflow Access Management, which are responsible for namespace sharing between the users and teams. We have PodDefaults for mutating our deployments, a central dashboard that ties everything together, TensorBoard, and a couple of web apps as well for managing other items. So to make sure I'll stay in time, I'll try to list all of these components and give you an update of where we're going. Some of them are for 1.7, some are not, but mostly I want to give you the direction that we have in mind for these components. Starting up, the most important one is the notebook CRD, and this one is the API that we have for launching ML-related IDs in Kubeflow. And traditionally, as I said before, we started in Kubeflow 0.5, and the main goal was to have Jupyter notebook support. And we've soon realized that this will be a limitation, especially at this point of Kubeflow, where we are also supporting other type of notebooks, such as RStudio and VS Code. So the first big item that we have in the list is something that we've been discussing a lot internally, and this is mostly a heads up about the discussions that we have and things that we want to have. And it's a migration to a more generic CRD, which is going to be a workbench CRD. Now, the main goal is to actually improve the support we have for other editors like the VS Code and RStudio, but also to ideally abstract all the necessary APIs that we have for actually being able to support arbitrary types of workbenches. Because right now it's actually quite hard-coded on what you can do with the notebook CRD. Plus, it's a little bit confusing the fact that we have notebooks, which is tightly related to Jupyter notebooks, being associated with other IDs like VS Code and RStudio. So I really want to stress this out a lot. We're going to have a couple of proposals on how to actually, what are the next steps, how this workbench CRD is going to look like, what is a migration plan, etc. The very high overview that I'd like you to keep in mind is what we have in mind, at least for 1.7, is initially we're just planning to do a simple rename of both the notebooks CRD as well as the Jupyter web app to a workbench controller and a workbench web app. We're planning to do almost exactly what KServe did, where we want to have a release with only a new CRD that is only renamed, completely nothing touching the API. And for any change to the API, we're going to have a process about how to extend it, etc. So the goal will be to have only one web app for 1.7, the Workbench web app, but it will also be supporting both this notebook CRD and the Workbench CRD. So this will allow users that are not yet ready, that have upgraded from 1.6 to 1.7 to stick with notebooks and not lose and be able to also follow the Workbench effort. And we are going to do some doc renamings so that all of the docs can follow up with a new terminology. And we've also had some similar discussions actually in a couple of issues in the past about how to have a more generic viewer. So at least the ideas we have in mind for extending the APIs beyond 1.7 lies in some of these issues. I'm just going to leave them there for anyone that wants to take a peek. And some further improvements that we want to do is a more generalized calling mechanism. And being able to support at least HTTP calling for any type of workbench, which can be supported with Istio, but we'll have more technical details on the following weeks on that. So following these changes on the notebook controller and CRD, we go to the Jupyter web app, which up to now was a web app for managing notebooks. And as you've guessed it from the previous section, the number one goal that we want to have for especially 1.7 is to do just a rename and go towards a workbench's web app. So it's more clear what we're managing and what its priorities are. So we're going to have, as I mentioned before, a migration plan, and the new web app is going to support both the notebook CRD that we previously had and the workbench CRD. Again, we're going to have a proposal where everyone will have a chance to look into the migration process and get some more feedback about how to handle the 1.7 release. So stay tuned for that one. We have some other more generic functionality that we wanted to implement, such as filtering and searching support for the front ends to allow us to more effectively being able to find the resources that we want. Although initially we're also going to do this on the front end side, so we're also going to need to start discussing how to also do this in the back end and have some pagination and work more efficiently with the Kubernetes API to achieve that. Also, we want to have a dedicated details page for its workbench, so users can also click on its workbench and use items over there like logs from the workbench, the YAML for the more advanced users, and some more user-friendly information about the server itself. And of course, be able to perform actions like start, stop, and connect to the notebook. And one of the good things that we want to do with such a details page is to also be able to start linking more and more the web apps between them. So users can also, if the notebook, for example, is going to have a link, they can click to that link and go to the volumes web app, which I just spoiled, but it will also have more links between it. So these are the immediate items we had for the Jupyter web app. Next up, for profiles and KFAM, which are the APIs we have for managing namespace and user permissions. One of the key goals that we always had in mind, but still trying to find the time to prioritize more and more, is the fact that we want to rely less on KFAM. And the reasons for that are quite a few. Right now, it projects a custom API on top of Kubernetes itself. And we want to find a more Kubernetes native way of both managing the permissions, as well as deciding what namespaces to show in the central dashboard, which all of these right now are dictated by KFAM. And the next big item that we'd like to invest more time on is actually profiles, and specifically the support for groups. And groups come to both the networking side, so we might need a new header that denotes the networking group, and need to extend Istio and deciding who has access to what resources based on the group. This will also require to extend our web apps security to also perform subject access reviews to ensure that we're also filtering based on groups and not just specific users. And we also will need to think a little bit more about how we're handling our aggregated roles and specifically role bindings for groups. So I'm also going to be mentioning some of the issues that we have these discussions for, and you can click on them after we share the slides. For the PodDefaults, this is the API we have for injecting default values in KF workloads. This is pretty straightforward. We want to support more parts of a pod spec. Ideally, we're use case driven here. So if you have a use case that is not covered, please file an issue or PR and we can evaluate. And the only thing we need to be careful here is, while it's easy to add new fields from a generic pod, if we're talking about a per container fields, then things can get a little bit hairy. For example, what if I want to inject things only in the notebook container or in the main container and not in a sidecar? And how do we even define a sidecar? So, I mean, which sidecar we want and which is the container that we want to target. So these are the discussion points for PodDefaults. For central dashboard, the list is quite simple, which is for central dashboard, it's the web app that links all of the web apps together. It's the one with the header on top and the links on the left. And the main problem that we have right now is we want to actually rewrite it in a newer framework, because right now it's based on Polymer, and that framework is really unmaintained. And this will really help us to be able to then start talking about more advanced features. So that goes for the central dashboard. Then for the model, for the volumes web app, which is the web app we have for managing the volumes, we want to have some of the common improvements for all of the web apps, like filtering and searching. Again, we will need some more support for the backends. We would like to have a dedicated detailed bad copy paste for each volume. And again, after clicking on the links for each volume, you can also navigate to the pages that this volume is being consumed from, whether this is a pipeline or this is a notebook. And lastly, which is the links between all the webs that I just covered. And last but not least, we have also the TensorBoards web app and the custom resource. So this is usually the little brother of the other web apps. And the most immediate goal, it's, as you can guess, the APIs that we have for managing TensorBoard instances. And the main item that we want to do is to also allow users to be able to spin up TensorBoard instances and mount them in any pod that is already doing training. Whether this means that the pod is whether it is that mounting a PVC that contains the logs, or being able to just observe an endpoint that contains the log as the training happens. And right now, the main limitation that we have with TensorBoard is a quite serious one, and it's regarding being able to access generic S3 logs with credentials. The problem right now that we need to mitigate is the fact that we need a mechanism to be able to dynamically inject credentials needed for TensorBoard into the pod itself. So some thoughts here are, okay, let's expect some credentials to be mounted in a specific directory. But the way that we really want to move forward with this is to actually be able to utilize PodDefaults as well, and expect PodDefaults to be our common language when we want to be injecting credentials into our different pods. So this way we can just define a pod default that contains the AWS credentials, and we can either mount this pod default in a notebook or in a TensorBoard. So an immediate goal here will be to allow TensorBoard to mount pod defaults, but a more long-term one, but we're not going to evaluate this for 1.7, is once we move to a workbench CRD that's going to be more generic, then maybe we can actually integrate the TensorBoard story into the workbench CRD, since we already have a story around credentials for the workbench CRD. But again, this is going to be a discussion topic for at least Kubeflow 1.8, since we really want to focus on a migration and defining the future of the workbench CRD first. And with that, I think I managed to do the presentation under 20 minutes. I'd like to give you a heads up to anyone that wants to get involved. We have the Slack channel and the GitHub. And also you can find the meeting notes, where you can also will find the links for the calendar that we have and for the Google Meets. Keep in mind, though, that you need to be a member of Kubeflow Discuss to access this, so just a reminder. And with this, I would really like to express my gratitude to the Kubeflow Summit sponsors for allowing us to have this summit. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimonas. Does anybody have any questions for Kimonas? Yes.
Are there any plans for or any feature requests that you have seen which are related to the profiles?
One common story that we've seen around profiles that we want to evaluate more is to actually how can we. So one of the use cases we have for profiles is to have user objects that we want to have in every namespace to at some point use profiles controller to do that. We already do it for ensuring permissions are copied over to different namespaces. So I think one of the items that we would also like to have a discussion about is how would it make sense to further extend the profile controller to be able to copy over credentials or default objects between namespaces. For example, say I want to have some default AWS credentials that will be copied on its user namespace. And I think we'll also see a similar support effort in pipelines where they have their own, I think, meta controller solution. So maybe we can see if we can migrate the two into one effort.
Okay. We have seen one more. I think this is a common theme we also received from some of our users. Another one we have observed is they want fine-grained permissions over managing contributors. So, for example, if I'm adding someone as a contributor, I want to be able to give them access only to view pipelines, or maybe just at least view access across all the applications in my namespace, instead of having them full access.
That's a pretty huge one, and it's also a very tricky one. The item I have in mind that also bites us quite a lot is to actually being able to also ensure that viewers of the platform cannot connect to actual instances, because if you can connect to any instance, whether this is a pipeline pod or a notebook, then you can get access to the underlying service account used by that workload. So we really need a more hardened story there around how to manage that. The problem, since we touched it, in my mind, is the fact that in this case, we need to do some to be able to restrict users to have network access, and this is managed by Istio. But right now, we defined all our permissions with Kubernetes RBAC. And the problem is right now, there's no way to define, I want user A to be able to have access to these resources via RBAC and have Istio respect them, unless we start maybe deploy some controller of our own that will be updating Istio's authorization policies of its own. But in any case, I think this is really a use case that we need to look more. Even if we can have a dirty solution of not allowing viewers to connect to the URLs, that would be a really huge step.